Hello, everyone, and welcome to the November APQC Knowledge Management webinar. Our topic today is the hidden power of unstructured data, and we have a special guest here. I'm Lynda Braksiek, and I'm the Principal Research Lead for Knowledge Management here at APQC. And before we begin, I just want to share a few quick housekeeping items with you. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to both the presentation and the recording after this session today. These materials will also be available in our resource library at apqc.org, and a summary of today's discussion will be written up and published within the next couple of months for access on our website as well. Any company names or examples that are provided will be anonymized when we publish the summary. Feel free to use the chat throughout the webinar. We love questions and comments and conversations that happen throughout. And you can also use the Q&A feature, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. If we don't get to all of them, we'll compile them and ensure that they get answered for you and sent as a follow-on. So before we begin to dive into the content for today, I want to introduce our very special guests for today. First, I'm excited to have our very own Dr. Carla Odell, who is APQC's chairman of the board. She's an author and she's a knowledge management pioneer. And as many of you know, Carla has been a great thought leader, a teacher, and a mentor and friend to multiple generations of knowledge management leaders, researchers, writers, practitioners, you name it. And that includes myself. So thank you, Carla, for being here. And she joins a lot of webinars with us, but today she's here to introduce our guest speaker because they have been longtime colleagues and friends as well. So take it away, Carla.
Thank you, Lynda. It's funny you say it. Tom has been my mentor from the first time I met him 30 years ago when he was a keynote speaker at APQC's first knowledge management conference, and I was just still learning how to spell the words. So known Tom
How can
ever
that be,
since then.
Carla? I'm only 35 years old now, so that's impossible.
You were young. You were very, very young. I think a lot of you are here. We have a great global audience, and a lot of you are here for one of the reasons I am too, which is that Tom has done more over the last 30 years or so to understand how organizations use data and analytics, how they do process improvement, and of course, knowledge management. And he's been at the forefront of all of those thought leadership movements around the world and has written over 300 articles that have been published, from the Harvard Business Review to the MIT Sloan Management Review, Forbes, Fortune, and on and on. He's written, I think it's 26 books now, Tom, is a lot. And 7 of those have been on AI, believe it or not. The first one was called Only Humans Need Apply, which still may be one of my favorite titles. And the most recent one is about agentic AI. But remember, ChatGPT and all of that only burst on the scene exactly 2 years ago this month. And he's already written 7 books on the subject. So the man has been looking at it for a while. But here's the key point. Tom looks at it from the point of view of what are organizations doing, what are they learning from doing it, and how can he share that with others? And so that has been what he's going to continue and do with us today. Just to think of the accolades he's gotten, he's a distinguished professor at Babson University. He's the Deloitte advisor on their data and analytics program. He's a member of the Analytics Hall of Fame. He's APQC's the first distinguished research fellow, and on and on. And I'm just delighted to have him with us today. So enough said. Take it away, Tom.
Thanks, Carla. Very happy to be doing something again with APQC. It's been a little while since I've darkened your virtual door, so nice to be here. Maybe I should say a little bit about sort of how I got to this set of topics. Is that the first slide? No, I guess it is. As Carla said, I did a lot of work in knowledge management, and I can still remember going to Houston for the first time with APQC in the, what was it, probably mid 90s or so, Carla. I did that for a while, and then some people slacked off being interested in what I was doing and saying in that regard. So I kind of shifted into looking at the management of structured data, which became analytics, which became big data, which became AI. And now I'm sort of back at knowledge management because people are very interested in using generative AI to help with that. So that's kind of been my journey relative to this topic. So I'm talking today about unstructured data, and it's really a bit of a misnomer because all data has some structure. Uh, Text we often think of as unstructured, but of course, in English we have 26 letters of the alphabet, and they tend to come in words and paragraphs, and we have capital letters and little letters and so on. So there is definitely a bit of structure there. Other languages have slightly different structures. Um, uh, Chemical entities have some structure. Um, we think of images as being unstructured, but of course they can all be disaggregated into pixels, and we can look at the brightness of each pixel and so on, and the color and that sort of thing. Um, we can look at even the genetic code as having structure, and a fair number of pharmaceutical companies are doing that. But for the most part, when we think of structured data, we tend to think of the sort of lower right-hand side, the sort of rows and columns of numbers. And when my students say, well, what do you mean by structured data? I generally say rows and columns of numbers. Um, it's probably more accurate to say more and less structured data. Obviously, something like a rows and columns of numbers is very easy to deal with. We've been looking at it in spreadsheets for a long time. It's easy to analyze and so on. But pretty much all of those other types of less structured or differently structured data can also be analyzed. It's just not quite as easy as it is for the traditional type of rows and columns of numbers. So I'm going to not talk much about rows and columns of numbers today, although increasingly I think organizations will want to look at the combination of um, structured data, numeric data that's very orderly, and whatever else, text, probably more commonly, but other things, other types of data as well. And maybe we'll lose this whole distinction between structured and unstructured at some point. Um, so just getting used to okay, how do I advance things? Um, Unstructured data that is external might be digitized books or articles, typically on the internet. Obviously, a lot of that has been scraped and put into large language models. Social media. We've also seen, this is not my topic today, but we've also seen some, I think, big improvements in the ability to analyze social media data. We used to have a tough time even figuring out, was it positive, negative, or neutral if somebody was commenting about our company or our brand or whatever. But now it's much easier to understand the subtleties of what people are saying, including sarcasm. For years, um, computers had a really tough time understanding sarcasm, but generative AI is actually quite good at it. And then news, and then you have all these other streaming video sites with massive amounts of content, and things coming in from customers and suppliers. But we also have a lot of internal, less structured data, emails and various types of product and marketing content, and our HR policies and proposals and contracts that we put out to customers or potential customers, and now conversations on tools like Slack and so on, and then of course enterprise content and knowledge management documents, assuming that you were smart enough to look at those kinds of things. And I think most organizations, when they think of knowledge management with relatively unstructured data, are only thinking about text, but there are other types as well. I was talking yesterday morning with the head of AI at Procter and Gamble, and he was saying, "Yeah, we have something called, I think it's Ask PG or PG Ask, which has all of that enterprise content in the form of documents accessible, but they also have PG Image, which has all of their commercials that they do and ads and brand images and so on. So I think increasingly we're going to see all kinds of media accessible using the technology that I'll be talking about. So unstructured data is important for a whole variety of reasons. You often hear, I have tried to track this down to see whether it is a valid statistic or not. You often hear 80% of all data in organizations is unstructured. Um, but I don't really think there is any good data. But it's fair to say that if you're counting bits, it's a majority of all data in organizations because unstructured data adds up really quickly, particularly when you're talking about images and video and so on. Um, uh, as you know, if you've worked with knowledge management, most of an organization's knowledge and intellectual property is in the form of unstructured data or less structured data as we've defined it. It's important because we've had lots of great techniques for storing, manipulating, analyzing structured data, rows and columns of numbers, but not nearly as many for analyzing the less structured type. Um, uh, APQC has done a great job of kind of keeping the flame going on knowledge management, but for many of the organizations that I worked with, things started to die down a little bit. There's some exceptions. I think most professional services firms are still quite interested in knowledge management, but it didn't have quite the popularity that it did during those halcyon days. And as a result, a lot of organizations didn't carefully manage their unstructured data. And I think it's despite many years of trying to, we've never fully exceeded at providing easy access to the kind of unstructured data that many people would benefit from having. And then along comes generative AI, which of course creates unstructured data. I think that's the primary purpose of it in most cases. But fortunately, it can also help to manage it. It can do all sorts of things like, summarize it or classify it or whatever. And its use can be augmented by a form of generative AI. So giving better and easier access through conversational means to that unstructured content. So, as I say, I think in the future we'll see more mixtures of structured and unstructured data. But now, most of the efforts that have gone into data management in companies over the last several years have been on structured data, and we need to make a bit of a shift. Okay. So I won't go through all of these, don't worry, but there are an awful lot of processes that depend upon the effective management of unstructured data. Um, I'm particularly interested in innovation and understanding customer and market insights. I'm doing a little research project on that now. I sent it to my editor at Harvard Business Review, I think earlier this week, actually, to see if they're interested in publishing it. My co-author and I, who Victor Dorfler has a background in knowledge management as well, talked to a number of companies, agencies, and vendors in this space, and it really is in some ways the golden age of customer and market insights. I can remember, Carla, I think you probably knew this guy as well. There was a man who was in charge of knowledge management at Procter and Gamble for a while. His name was Larry Houston. He had some innovation oriented roles. And he once told me that he had the key to the room where they locked up all of the various market research studies that have been done at Procter and Gamble over the years. And Procter and Gamble actually just celebrated last year its 100th year of doing market research. The first project, when somebody named Procter was still actually the last Procter to be running the company, said to an economist who was working with them, maybe you should figure out whether people are buying Ivory soap to wash their clothes or to wash their bodies. And market research at P&G was born. I don't know if the report on that study was in Larry Houston's room, but anyway, the most important thing is Larry Houston told me, this was probably 20 years ago. He said, I go up into that room and I look around and I see if there are any footprints in the dust other than mine, and there never are. But that is changing pretty dramatically. I think we can also do, I actually do have a book even more recent than the agentic AI one. It's called The New Science of Customer Relationships, and it talks about how we can learn so much more from customers and about customers these days with generative AI than we could before. So we can also look at strategy and legal and accounts payable and receivable. I was talking yesterday with a big firm that uses generative AI agents to take all the important data out of invoices from vendors and pays them automatically, drastically reducing the amount of human labor necessary to do that. And boring stuff like IT log files. Anyway, lots of possibilities there that we can make better in terms of business processes that depend on this type of unstructured data. Um, so, knowledge management, uh, as I say, APQC doing a great job of keeping the flame going, but it's always had its challenges, I think I would say. Um, some people don't really care all that much about knowledge. That's a hard one to rectify or change. The technology wasn't always that great. First, we had Lotus Notes, and then SharePoint. I often say SharePoint, where knowledge goes to die. Sorry if you work for Microsoft or whatever. It was hard to find that desired content. There were conflicting and overlapping versions of knowledge documents unless you'd done a great job of human curation of that content. External knowledge was, in many cases, post Google, easier to find than internal. And that was, I think, a source of frustration both to knowledge managers and to users of knowledge. And it was difficult, I think, in many cases to demonstrate economic value. Now, sad to say, some of those things are still an obstacle. If your organization doesn't really care about knowledge, then generative AI isn't necessarily going to make them care as you go forward either. The technology, I think, will be a lot better than what we had in the past, and it'll be easier to find desired content, but that human curation, sorry to say, is still going to be required. So this sort of APQC's other big thing, and one of my other big interests is process management as well. This kind of looks like a process, and it's not really. It just is intended to show all of the things that generative AI can do with unstructured data. I think we're most familiar with, we put in a prompt and it comes back with an answer, but it can generate all sorts of new content and evaluate it if you give it, some criteria or a rubric by which to evaluate it. My experience in, like most professors, I hate grading, and my experience at using it for grading is sort of mixed at best. It does generate lots of feedback about the students' essays and so on. it does not do a very good job of differentiating the grades they get. It's like everybody gets a B plus, in my experience anyway. You can clearly summarize and categorize content, which is really often quite useful for knowledge management purposes. As I say, when I was talking about accounts payable, it can extract the salient information from, an invoice or a contract, and it can synthesize multiple content sources and turn them into one unified whole. Probably more things too. So I think the big breakthrough after the development of generative AI was something called RAG. You may have heard about this. It stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. Um, when I first started writing about how organizations could get some of their own content into generative AI models, um, it wasn't quite that clear that you could basically do that from scratch. And there were some companies like Bloomberg that did that from scratch with all of their financial information. You could do what was called fine tune the model, which is you sort of recalculate the models with some additional content, but not all new content. Both of those things turned out to be quite difficult to do and expensive and time consuming and involving a lot of technical talent. So, what emerged when I first wrote about this in Harvard Business Review, I called it prompt tuning, but somebody else, actually a team at Meta, wrote a paper that referred to it as retrieval augmented generation, and that caught on. It's basically a means of a putting the content that you want into the large language model as if it were a prompt, um, but only the content that you really care about. I first really heard about this at Morgan Stanley, and they had started working 18 months before ChatGPT came out in November 2022 with OpenAI, and they wanted to take 100,000 documents about investing and company analysis and so on, everything that really mattered to them, and put it into a large language model. Now, the problem with putting 100,000 documents in, of course, in a prompt is you have things called context windows. How many tokens can you actually put in? And there are some language models that are much bigger than others in terms of their context windows, but in general, you'd have a really tough time putting 100,000 documents, each of several pages, into a large language model. And since you're charged by the token, in your prompts, that would be extremely expensive. So, what you do with RAG, generally speaking, is you take your content, say your 100,000 documents, you convert that into what are called embeddings. It's basically just numerical equivalents of those tokens or words, roughly speaking. You store that in a vector database, and then when you do the prompt with what you want to find out, it compares that prompt to the vector database entries and says, okay, what content in that vector database is most similar to the content being asked for in the prompt? And it pulls it into the prompt and submits it to the large language model. And it has several benefits. One, you can use all the conversational capabilities of large language models to have a very easy way of accessing that content. Hallucinations generally don't occur nearly as often. It tells you exactly what documents are being used in the answer that you've gotten, which is not often the case, accurately anyway, in large language models. I find in working with my students that I always tell them they have to show their sources. And if the source is absolutely perfect for the topic that they're looking at, some esoteric topic like, I don't know, the use of AI. I teach AI courses, I have to let them use AI. But if it relates to their essay on the use of AI in the refrigerated trucking industry or something like that, and the source says the title of the document is AI in the refrigerated trucking industry by so and so, it's almost 100% likely to be made up by the language model. It's crazy. Um, however, that content that you're putting into the system, as I say, it has the same problem that we had with language, with content in knowledge management. If it's not of high quality, if you're trying to figure out what's the best proposal for selling a windmill to a city government, it's generative AI is not going to know what's the best proposal unless some human has gone through and said, "Here's the best proposal," and that's the one that we're gonna load into the system. If we're talking about images, of course, you have to have labels for those images that would make them easier to call up. Okay, so uh, somehow another, speaking of data quality, stray R ended up in this title, but uh, a couple of guys and I wrote an article recently on you have to really focus on the quality of your unstructured data. As I said, most organizations haven't done that recently. They focused on structured data quality. Tom Redman calls himself the data doctor, obsessed with this issue of data quality. And, I never found it topic, but it's certainly very important. And so we really looked at what does data quality mean in the context of unstructured data that's being used for these RAG related use cases. So the data needs to be relevant to whatever problem you're addressing. We don't want to have too much duplicated content. Wow, that error automatically fixed itself. No, thank you, Lynda. I think you did that. The information has to be complete and accurate and up to date, of course. If it's obsolete, it's not going to help you very much. I found when I do this work with my students, I ask them to look at different types of use cases. So some of them are doing healthcare, and it says uh, they say very confidently out of the language model, the best AI solution for addressing healthcare issues is IBM Watson. Because IBM for years did all this advertising, very successful on how Watson Health was going to cure cancer and do all sorts of other things, and that content is still there, even though IBM doesn't even own Watson Health anymore. So you have to make sure that everything is up to date. Both tagging and knowledge graphs improve the content retrieval process. So, the more effort you put in to kind of classify what the content is and how it's related to other content, the more likelihood you're going to get something out. Again, this is the same as what we had previously. As I said, you have to determine what's best in the curation process. Entity resolution may be required for semi-structured data. So, if you have a name as a classifier or whatever, you have to make sure that that name refers to the particular person that you're talking about. And an unstructured data dictionary would be great. You don't find them terribly often, but this is something that's also true in structured data quality, of course. You typically have to make some decisions of how you're going to address this unstructured data issue. Um, uh, Companies, organizations have a lot of unstructured data, lots of documents, lots of emails, lots of Slack conversations, et cetera, et cetera. You can't manage it all. You can't improve the quality of it. You can't curate it all. So what is most important and ideally already curated? I mentioned Morgan Stanley earlier. They were very lucky in a sense, or prescient, because when generative AI came along and they wanted to do these 100,000 best, most important documents. 5 years previously, there had been some complaints about the quality of documents in the corporate intranet, and they'd established a process with an offshore group of knowledge curators who would go through each document. There were 20 people. They would classify 20 attributes of each document to make sure it's well tagged, accurate, unique, etc. So they were ready to go, but most organizations are not ready to go. Who's going to do that curation? My view, companies are telling me if you can get, if it's a customer service application, then ideally you'd get customer service people doing the curation. Now, they have other jobs, of course. It's hard to find time to do that. But I think as opposed to having some central knowledge management or IT group do it, there's just too much to be done. So, and the people at the front lines have familiarity with what the issues are and what the documents that are available are and so on. You still need agreement on key terms and documents. We talked to one company that said we had all sorts of things that defined an insurance claim in a different way. And so we had to really agree on what we meant by a claim. So we were sure we got the right content out when somebody asked something about a claim. As I say, the more context and classification you provide, the better, but that takes more effort. So you can do this RAG-based stuff without tags or graphs. It's just you're going to get better retrieval if you put some more effort into it. You can use generative AI to help with the curation a bit, and I can't do it all, but it can sort of categorize content. It can tag it, can do pretty well at tagging. It can say these documents appear to be duplicative. There is some help that the tools can provide. How do you, once you do it once, you probably want to continue to refine the content over time. So how do you institutionalize it? And is there content particularly you'd say content that's important to your organization from even a legal standpoint? How do you validate it and make sure that you're giving the right answer?
Hey, Tom. Hey, Tom, before you move on, we do have a
Sure,
question in the chat. Would it be okay if I interrupted you for a second and see, I
sure.
think it's
Yeah.
relevant. We have someone asking a question. Can you talk more about why a data dictionary would benefit RAG? They said they're building dictionaries at the moment and have been considering one for unstructured at the same time where they're building a RAG AI tool. And they would love to be able to defend their instincts on why this could be important.
Well, having a dictionary can help for generative AI. You can you can actually put the data dictionary into the RAG process. But I think the greatest help is actually for the humans involved to say, what content do we have? What content do we need? Where did it come from? Just to give you some sense of what's high quality and what isn't, and who did it, and so on. So, as I say, some technical benefits, but I think more benefits come to humans. So, lessons for the current era with generative AI and RAG from classical knowledge management. Sorry, AI doesn't solve all knowledge management problems. As I say, if your organization doesn't care about knowledge, it probably won't help too much. As my late lamented colleague Larry Prusak used to say, knowledge flows are more important than knowledge stocks. So you can focus with generative AI and RAG and so on just on knowledge access, but there are tools we found out in this project on customer and market insights that help with knowledge creation, that help with analysis of unstructured or qualitative market research, for example, and even on the usage side to, as I say, relate the content that comes out of these systems to particular problems that you're trying to solve. Caring about knowledge is probably the most important thing, and that for the whole organization to care about knowledge, you probably need senior management stakeholders. This is kind of knowledge, going back to knowledge management 101. Um, I think at some organizations, and we found this even with regard to generative AI, AI-oriented knowledge managers should not be sort of sitting at a desk as reference librarians and saying, "What do you want? We'll find it for you." They need to get involved in whatever the business processes of the organization are, and suggest how better content and knowledge can improve that process. As we often said in knowledge management, pointers to people are often just as valuable or more valuable than documents. So, and you can do that quite easily through generative AI as well. It's unlikely that you're going to take all of the important unstructured data and create one big knowledge repository with these new tools. It might work, but chances are good it's going to be very poorly curated, and the more knowledge you have, the harder it is to find the stuff that's really important. So I think it's better to have a lot of small repositories. As I said, AI can't decide what's the best knowledge, and you need to demonstrate how the use of AI-based KM leads to value, just as we did for non-AI-based KM. So I think I am done, and happy to discuss it more, answer more questions, whatever anybody wants to do. And I hope that Lynda and Carla, you'll weigh in on some of these issues that you've seen with APQC members too.
Yeah, we have a couple questions coming in right now, Tom, so I'll grab those first. And I know I wrote down a couple of myself, and I'm sure Carla and anybody else, please keep popping them in the chat or the Q&A. But one person asked, you just spoke on this topic, so I'll go to this one first, but you said the one big knowledge repository doesn't necessarily work. And this person said, what does work? And you mentioned, a bunch of small repositories, but maybe can you say a little more about that? Because I know we talk to a lot of people who are trying to move to one, source of truth and getting to that one knowledge base. So maybe say a little more about that. See if you can help people.
Yeah, this is just a overwhelmingly large project if you try to make it one big repository, at least for a large organization. And I think you're much better off to say, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Okay, we're trying to answer customer questions better in our contact center. That is a very different type of content than what you're going to get in terms of human resource policies. So ultimately, I think you have this with some language models, like DeepSeek is a good example of this, where you could have all of these smaller repositories accessible. And if the question that comes in, the prompt that comes in is about human resource policies, then it would only go into that particular repository. But that would take some, I think OpenAI calls that a router-based approach. That would take more technical sophistication to do. But A, I think you'd get better content, and B, you'd spend a lot less money on tokens and on your vendor cost for your language model, and they'd have to build fewer data centers, and the world would be much better off.
I love that because I know we get a lot of conversations around people who they're trying to deal with the thousands and thousands of SharePoint sites that have been created over the years and figuring out what's the best way to then take all of that and develop several small ones, make one big one, what have you. So I like the focus on what problem are you really trying to solve, right? And what's going to work best for your organization as well. So, okay, we have another couple of questions in here. And it's really around a couple of these are kind of aligned, really the quantifying the value of KM to generative AI. And I'm going to mix it with the other question the same person asked that said, how do we then convince data and tech leaders to care about the knowledge management and knowledge quality portion of that as well?
Yeah, well, that's another reason I think for, relatively decentralized approaches to this problem. If you are looking at a RAG-based LLM environment for customer service, say, you can measure, are we answering those questions faster? Do we need somewhat fewer people to handle customer questions? Are customers more satisfied? So you can develop some metrics and get some sense of value. If it's one huge big repository, you're never going to be able to do that very well. So uh, I think it's definitely an important question. There have been, those of you who follow generative AI know there have been a lot of issues about the thing that doesn't yield value are the approaches. Somebody wrote about this in Harvard Business Review recently, and I wrote a related article. It's not the individual level enablement. It's enabling a particular business process or a particular business function, and those tend to be deeper and narrower and easier to measure value.
Yeah, no, that's good. Somebody put in here too the comment. They just said that they worked in they work in KM in a big professional services organization, and they do use a centralized function, but they also said their content's highly curated as well, right? So if it's managed effectively, then I think that model works, like what you said. So I
Yeah,
like
if you're all in, if you're all in the same business, fine. And in professional services, that's often the case. Um, if you're in a if you're in a big four organization, if I'm Deloitte, for example, I probably, and this was always the case with knowledge management, as I recall, you probably don't want your consulting knowledge base to be the same as your tax knowledge base or your accounting knowledge base or whatever. You want to start to disaggregate it a little bit.
yeah. Okay, we have another question here. Do you have any opinions on companies building their own LLM tools in combination with a RAG tool to manage permissions and relevance versus using something like Copilot that can already access your underlying environment?
Well, it's funny. Yesterday, I went out on a limb and I said, whenever I hear that a company is using Copilot, I say, not much value there, because it does tend to be the sort of broad and shallow oriented approaches to using generative AI. It says, oh, go out and find, see if this works for your emails or your blog posts or whatever. And I tend to, from a value standpoint, as I say, I tend to be much more of an advocate of a smaller number of deep and narrow projects. Um, uh, I do think that it can be a very valuable tool, and we need some way to take valuable applications of tools like Copilot and move them up for enterprise level considerations. So you can see, do we want to invest the time and effort to do more in that space? I don't know. I don't see that particular question. I'm sort of having the feeling that perhaps I didn't answer it all, but I can't. Is that okay? Building your own LLM tools, I think, is generally a
Mhm.
bad idea. However, maybe this is what you mean. There are plenty of open source tools that you can start with that I think are increasingly quite capable. Building your own from scratch, I think, unless you're a vendor, um, recipe for heartbreak, I would say.
Okay. Now we have a whole bunch of questions coming in, so I'm going to try to keep these as best I can in order. This one takes a little bit of a different perspective, and it actually is a little bit about what I wanted to ask as well. So, Someone said with a lot of overemphasis on Gen AI, agentic AI, will the value of people and experts diminish in organizations?
Yeah, we won't need them anymore. They'll be gone. No. I think that we need to figure out sort of how do we use these tools in moderation. I last week or the week before, I wrote a little piece for Substack. All my Substacks are free, so anybody can read the whole thing on de-skilling in healthcare, and I found several different circumstances that I was personally involved in that where some potential de-skilling seemed to be, or potential or actual de-skilling seemed to be taking place. So I think, and there's this interesting research about how extensive use of generative AI quote, rots your brain, unquote,
Mhm.
because you really don't use your brain enough to create the content. And so I think we have to learn how to use it in moderation. Just like, we learn we have to eat and drink in moderation and sit on our couches and watch TV in moderation and so on. Otherwise, I think we'll end up with um, not only experts who don't feel valued and leave the organization, but what skills that a lot of people have tend to atrophy. So I'm thinking actually about writing a little piece. I don't know if any of you ever saw this research on some nuns, I think somewhere in Europe, and some of them did a lot of writing, and the nuns that did a lot of writing had a much lower incidence of dementia than the ones that didn't. So, in 20 or 30 years, we may find heavy use of generative AI may lead to dementia.
Oh my
Um,
God.
but I'm not clearly qualified to say that, but I think it might get some people's attention if I do.
Yeah, and on this same topic, the individual in the chat here, Gopal, he said that the other issue that they're seeing is a loss of trust. Whatever we create, people are assuming that we're using Chat GPT or Copilot to generate it. So human creativity is taking a hit. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's a big behavior challenge involved here, and we have to persuade basically the entire organization that these are powerful and useful tools, but um, I don't know if you heard this term work slop. They create content in many cases that is not very interesting. And of course, it's derived from tons of stuff that's been said on the internet. So I think we have to tell people your job is to add value to the content, either by the creative prompts that you use or the edits that you make to the output. Now, the downside, of course, and my students tell me this all the time. They say, gee, the essays you're making us write with all these behavior changes, it was much easier to just paraphrase a Wikipedia article and submit it. Um, it doesn't, it does take away some of the benefits of generative AI in terms of productivity, but it has the benefit of, preserving that trust and keeping our brains perking along.
Yeah. And that concept of human, you even mentioned it earlier about human curation still has to be there. It has to exist. The human has to be part of the process. And I think as knowledge management professionals, experts are at the heart of everything that we do, right? Because we're trying to preserve that expertise for future generations, and we need experts to understand how valued they are and what their role is in this new world, right, of working in AI. So I think that's a very valuable thing. I read a great article last week, Tom, on the impact on critical thinking, right? It was about this very, very topic. So maybe that's your next book, right? How do we retain critical thinking skills in this era of of AI, right? So
It's funny. A guy I know quite well asked me a few months ago to co-author a book on critical thinking, And unfortunately, I looked around. It turns out we don't know that much about how to create critical thinking. Some people have it, some people don't. Even when you have it in a particular domain, it's hard to transfer into another domain. So I
Sure.
doubt I'll be writing that book, but it would be good if somebody would.
It would be good. It would be good. Okay, I'm going to move to another question. Someone asked about the governance. What kind of governance do you really need to enable knowledge management to for this era of AI or for generative AI? What kind of governance are we talking? Is it different? Is it the same as what we've kind of done in the past?
Well, I have to confess that working a lot in data management and with chief data officers and so on, I try to discourage people from using the term governance. I like to use the term enablement because
Okay.
nobody likes to be governed very much. And so, in any case, what enablement means is making it easy to do the right thing. And so. Yeah, clearly, a lot of people were worried early on about revealing intellectual property with putting it into generative AI. Now, I think the vast majority of organizations have deals with their cloud provider that make it quite easy to avoid revealing intellectual property. I was working a few months ago with a big property and casualty insurance company, commercial insurance company, and they have a lot of knowledge about what's safe and adds to risk or takes away from risk and so on in commercial property. And they were some people at the company, some executives were very worried. Well, if we get it into a generative AI system like this, anybody will just be able to walk out the door with it. Well, that's not the case because, it's all in these vector databases. They'd be walking out with a bunch of numbers that, unless they were data scientists, they would probably have a hard time doing anything with. So I think, going light on the governance, but making it easy for people to do the right thing, not reveal intellectual property, not put content in that doesn't belong in your content repository. Don't do what OpenAI and Anthropic and all these other LLM companies have done, which is to, just scrape content off the internet wherever they could find it.
All right. I think we're gonna at least do one more question and see here how much time. We've got about 7 minutes left, but here's one. If organizations don't care much about managing knowledge, but want to seize AI potential in business activities, should KM processes be considered a prerequisite?
Um, well, yeah, I think yes, you need those KM capabilities, but I think you don't necessarily want to advertise them as knowledge management. What you want to advertise them as, we're very good at helping frontline people take product knowledge or market knowledge or supply chain knowledge or whatever, and embedding it into systems that make it accessible to anybody who needs it. And if the company's not supportive of knowledge in the abstract, they may well be supportive of knowledge that leads to better performance in those particular types of processes or business functions.
Yeah, I like that. Speaking the language of the business usually gets a lot more attention than saying, "Hey, we're KM and we're here to help," right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I like that. Okay,
Lynda,
maybe one more. Yeah,
Lynda,
go
this is
ahead.
Carla. Can I interrupt on one thing?
Yeah.
So I think it's really important that we be able to put new knowledge, new information into the system as we move along. And the reason for that is if the RAG and the AI system has told us that the best way to respond to, for example, a customer service inquiry about product availability, we need to, that's where an experiment starts to happen when people start to use it. And that tells us whether it worked or not. How do we continue to feed new content in? Otherwise, we're just breathing our own exhaust over and over again.
Yeah, the good point, Carla. That's relatively easy to do. You can just add new new document or content into your vector database. It's quite easy to do. I think you and I were talking about this earlier. Where do you get the ability to do all of this stuff if you're not a data scientist? And it turns out that all the major cloud providers offer the capability of building a RAG environment and converting it to embeddings and a vector database and so on. So, and I have talked to non-technical knowledge managers who said they were able to do a RAG-based environment. David Wu at Morgan Stanley did it in that early system they adopted without, having to, be a data scientist or a computer scientist.
Love that. Great question, Carla. All right, we're going to get one more. See if we can get one more in, Tom, okay?
Okay.
This one says, if you sit with multiple content stores and none are perfect, do you start all fresh, fix what you have as you go, or scrap everything? And they said they tend to think, work with what you have, and based on the questions, fix that data first. But is there a better way?
I think that's probably the best approach. I mean, it obviously depends a little bit on the particular context that you're talking about, but um, I think if you feel like there is, a substantial kernel of useful content in that particular store, it's better to work with that and try to improve the quality of it and, weed out the content that isn't as useful as compared to starting from scratch. Starting from scratch in many cases would mean that, again, you'd have to get the relevant experts to produce entirely new content. And, if I were one of those relevant experts, I'd say, I just did that last year. Why don't you start with that one?
Agreed. No, good. I love it. And before we kind of close out, Carla, did you have any final questions for Tom or comments or anything?
One of the things that I think was really important that you said is when you're using your own content and it's focused and narrow, perhaps on a process, it's going to business process. One, it's very easy to make the business case and then to actually prove the business case, which is great. The second is that you're more likely to be able to catch errors, and they will still occur. I mean, we live in a quantum universe, right? There will still be errors, garbage in, garbage out. But I just wanted to say that this is really where the value is going to come from, is not people just using the chat, the Copilot that's on their desk to just ask the general world a question, which will come back with a lot of stuff that's not correct, alarmingly so if you start checking sources. But to look at your own stuff is really going to be powerful.
Yeah, no, I agree. And almost every organization has important content that they could put into these systems. So I think that there's much more potential than this sort of generic knowledge that you get in generative AI models.
Love that. Well, Tom and Carla, thank you so much. I'm just going to close out our webinar today by saying it was thrilling to have you both here. And there were several comments in the chat about people who have worked with both of you over the years, and they were happy to be here and see and hear from you both today. And just a reminder to everybody that we always try to give you a list of some resources we have available at APQC for those that are members and those that are non-members as well. We want to try to keep fresh with our research. Give us your feedback. Let us know what you think, but we try to stay up on all of these things. And there's a couple of articles in here that we did interviews with Tom over the last couple of years related to AI as well, if you're interested in that. And also some upcoming engagements going on. So we're redoing our productivity research here at APQC, and we're going to be doing a roundtable in December to close out our year on the impacts that process and knowledge management have both on productivity. And then we'll kick off the new year like we always do, talking about what are those big priorities for knowledge management. And guess what's leading the way? I think you can all guess what's leading the way, right? What we were talking about today, all of that AI. So it'll be interesting to see what kinds of conversations we have early next year. And as a reminder, we always have great training at APQC as well. So just want to say thank you to everyone. And for those questions that didn't get answered, we will send those over to Tom, and hopefully he will give us some good answers we can supply for you in a written format, along with the webinar and the slides from today's presentation. And with that, we hope to see you again at a future APQC webinar. And again, thank you, Tom and Carla. Have a wonderful day.